The wind howled through the canyon like a wounded animal as Jacob Matthews noticed the figure stumbling through the snow toward his cabin. At first, he thought it was a trick of the fading light. But then he saw her clearly, a woman wrapped in what looked like deerskin and thin blankets, her legs barely holding her weight. She collapsed just 20 feet from his door. Jacob didn't hesitate. In this wilderness, hesitation meant the difference between life and death. He rushed out into the bitter cold, scooped her into his arms, and carried her inside. What he didn't know was that this single act of kindness would change everything he thought he understood about his solitary life in the Montana Territory. Jacob had been living alone in his cabin for 3 years now, ever since he'd left the mining camps down south. He'd grown tired of the violence, the endless greed, and the way men turned on each other over a handful of gold dust. Here, in this remote valley where the Yellowstone River carved through ancient stone, he'd found something resembling peace. He trapped beaver and marten, sold the pelts twice a year at the trading post 40 miles east, and kept to himself. It was a simple existence, but it was his. The woman was unconscious when he laid her on his bed near the stone fireplace. Her skin was cold as river water, her lips tinged blue. Jacob had seen frostbite before, and he worked quickly, removing her wet moccasins and wrapping her feet in warm wool. Her clothing was unusual, not the typical dress of settlers or even the practical gear of frontier women. The deerskin was decorated with intricate beadwork and patterns he'd never seen, and her dark hair was braided with what looked like eagle feathers and small bones. She was native, that much was clear, but from which tribe he couldn't say. He built up the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm, then prepared a weak broth from dried venison. She'd need sustenance when she woke, but nothing too heavy for a system that had been pushed to its limit. As he worked, he found himself studying her face. She was young, perhaps 25, with high cheekbones and a straight nose. Even in her weakened state, there was something striking about her, something that suggested strength rather than fragility. She woke just before midnight, her eyes snapping open with such sudden alertness that Jacob stepped back instinctively. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, her dark eyes taking in everything, the cabin, the fire, his face. Then she spoke in English that was heavily accented, but clear. "You brought me inside." "Couldn't very well leave you to freeze," Jacob said, offering her a cup of the warm broth. "What were you doing out there? Nearest settlement is 2 days' ride in good weather." She took the cup but didn't drink immediately. Instead, she continued to study him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I was traveling," she said finally. "I became lost in the storm." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about the way she said it made Jacob doubt its complete truth. Still, it wasn't his business to interrogate a woman who'd nearly frozen to death. "You're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel. There's a trading post east of here. They'll help you get wherever you're headed." "You live alone," she said. It wasn't a question. "I do." "No wife?" Jacob felt his jaw tighten. "No wife. No family. Just me in the mountains." She nodded slowly, then finally drank from the cup. As she did, he noticed the calluses on her hands, the lean muscle in her forearms. This was no pampered woman. She was accustomed to hard work, to survival. When she finished the broth, she handed the cup back to him. "My name is Ayanna. It means eternal blossom in my language. Jacob Matthews, welcome to my home such as it is." "You are kind," she said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she was making a judgment about him, tallying his qualities against some internal measure he couldn't fathom. Over the next few days, Ayanna recovered her strength with remarkable speed. By the second morning, she was up and moving around the cabin, examining everything with that same intense attention. She touched his books, the few he owned, running her fingers over the leather bindings. She studied the way he'd constructed the furniture, the efficiency of his small kitchen, the organization of his tools. It was as if she were cataloging every aspect of his life. Jacob found himself both intrigued and unsettled by her presence. She was unlike any woman he'd known, settler or native. She moved with a quiet grace, never wasting motion, never idle. When he went to check his trap lines, she came with him, learning the routes without being told, noting the places where game trails crossed, where water ran, even in winter. She was a quick study, absorbing information like a sponge, absorbs water. On the third evening, as they sat by the fire eating a meal of roasted rabbit and root vegetables, she began to tell him about herself, or at least a version of herself. "My people live to the west," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the mountains. "We follow the old ways, hunting and gathering, moving with the seasons. But the world is changing. The white men come with their treaties and their promises, and nothing is as it was." Jacob nodded. He'd seen it himself, the way the frontier was filling up with settlers, miners, ranchers. The native peoples were being pushed onto smaller and smaller parcels of land, their traditional ways of life disrupted or destroyed. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "To this lonely place?" He considered lying, giving her some simple answer, but something about her directness demanded honesty in return. "I was tired of what men become when they want something badly enough. In the mining camps, I saw friends turn on each other over claims. I saw men lose their humanity, chasing yellow metal in the ground. I wanted no part of it anymore. So you ran away. I prefer to think of it as walking toward something different." She smiled at that, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, bringing warmth to features that had seemed almost severe in their intensity. Perhaps that is the same thing, seen from different directions. On the fourth day, something shifted. Ayanna had been helping Jacob split firewood, her movements efficient and practiced. When she suddenly stopped and tilted her head, listening, Jacob heard it too. Horses, several of them, approaching from the south. He tensed instinctively. He rarely had visitors, and unannounced company in the wilderness was usually trouble. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, all native men, all armed. Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle he always kept near the door, but Ayanna touched his arm, staying him with a gesture. "They are of my people," she said quietly. "They mean no harm." The lead rider was an older man, his face weathered like ancient bark, his eyes sharp and assessing. He spoke to Ayanna in a language Jacob didn't understand, a rapid exchange that seemed part question, part report. She responded at length, occasionally gesturing toward Jacob or the cabin. The old man's gaze never left Jacob's face, and he felt like he was being weighed, measured, evaluated, for purposes he couldn't begin to guess. Finally, Ayanna turned to Jacob. "This is White Eagle. He is like a father to me. He came looking for me when the storm passed, and I did not return." "Return from where?" Jacob asked, his suspicion finally crystallizing into words. "What were you really doing out there, Ayanna?" She exchanged a long look with White Eagle, who nodded slightly. "Perhaps," she said, "it is time for truth between us." They went inside the cabin, all of them, though the space felt crowded with so many people. White Eagle's companions remained near the door, silent and watchful. The old man sat at Jacob's small table and began to speak, with Ayanna translating. "My people are few now," he said through her. "We have been pushed back into the mountains, away from the valleys where we once roamed freely. The government wants us to go to a reservation, to live in one place, like we are not hunters, but farmers. Many of our young men have been lost to violence or sickness. Many of our young women have been taken or have fled to the white settlements. We are becoming shadows of what we once were." Jacob listened, seeing the pain in the old man's eyes, understanding suddenly that this was not just a story, but a plea, a confession of desperation. "Our tribe has a tradition," Ayanna continued, her voice soft but steady. "When we face danger, when our future is uncertain, we send out a seeker. This person is chosen by the elders, someone with wisdom and courage, someone who can judge the hearts of others. The seeker travels in secret, observing, learning, and when they find a person of good character, someone who might strengthen our people, they bring back a report." The understanding hit Jacob like a physical blow. "You're the seeker." She met his eyes without flinching. "I am. And you were sent to, what? Find a husband? That's why you were out in that storm?" The pieces were falling into place now, the strange intensity of her observations, the way she'd cataloged every aspect of his life and character. "Not just any husband," White Eagle said through Ayanna. "We do not seek to trick or trap. We seek partnership, strength, someone who can walk between both worlds, someone who understands hardship but has not let it make him cruel, someone who chooses isolation not from hatred but from disappointment, which means hope is not yet lost in him." Jacob stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, soft and relentless. "So this was all a test? You deliberately put yourself in danger to see if I'd help you?" "No," Ayanna said firmly. The storm was real. My danger was real. I had been traveling for 3 weeks, visiting different areas, observing different men. Some I saw from a distance and knew immediately they were not suitable. Others I approached in different ways, in towns, at trading posts. You were the last on my journey before I was to return home. I was making my way to your valley when the storm caught me. The cold was more than I expected. I truly would have perished if you had not found me. But you were testing me, Jacob insisted. These past days, everything you did was to evaluate whether I was worthy. Yes, she admitted. That is my duty to my people. But Jacob, what I found was not what I expected. White Eagle spoke again, his voice grave, and Ayanna translated. The seeker has the right to refuse all candidates. She can return and say that no one is suitable. We do not force this. It must be a choice made freely on both sides, or it means nothing. Jacob turned back to face them, trying to process everything he'd just learned. And what did you find, Ayanna? What's your report going to say? She stood, moving to stand near the fireplace, her face half in shadow. I found a man who acts without expectation of reward, who pulled a stranger from the snow and asked nothing in return, who lives simply but not meanly, who left violence behind not because he was afraid of it, but because he was disgusted by it, who speaks to me as an equal, not as something lesser, because I am a woman or because my skin is darker than his. That's just basic decency, Jacob said, uncomfortable with the praise. You would think so, White Eagle said through her, but we have learned that such decency is rarer than gold in these mountains. Ayanna took a breath. I have already told White Eagle that if I make a formal choice, it would be you. But that choice means nothing if you do not make the same one. You have a right to hear our proposal, to understand what we offer and what we ask, and then to accept or refuse. Jacob's mind was spinning. Hours ago he'd been living his simple, solitary life. Now he was being asked to make a decision that would change everything. Tell me, he said. Tell me all of it. What followed was an explanation that lasted until the fire burned low. White Eagle and Ayanna painted a picture of a people struggling to survive, caught between their traditional ways and the relentless pressure of westward expansion. They spoke of a tribe that had once numbered in the hundreds, now reduced to barely 70 souls. They described children growing up without fathers, young women without partners, a future that seemed to be closing in like winter darkness. We need new blood, White Eagle said. We need strength, but we also need wisdom. We have learned that some white men who join us bring only violence and greed. They see our women as possessions, our ways as primitive. This is worse than being alone, so now we are more careful. The seeker does not just look for strength of body, but for strength of character. And if I agreed, Jacob said slowly, what would that mean? I'd live with your tribe, follow your ways. You would be one of us, Ayanna said. You would learn our language, our customs, our traditions, but we do not ask you to forget who you are. We have learned that the strongest trees are those that can bend in the wind. We need people who can walk in both worlds, who understand the white man's ways, but choose to honor ours. Your skills as a trapper, your knowledge of trade, these would be valuable to us, but more valuable would be your example of a man who chooses honor over profit. And you and I would be, he couldn't quite finish the question, married in time, she said directly, if that is what develops between us. But there is no force in this, Jacob. You would live among us first. We would come to know each other truly. The seeker's choice is a beginning, not an ending. It opens a door. Whether you walk through it and whether I walk through it with you, those are choices we would make day by day. White Eagle added something in their language, and Ayanna translated with a slight smile. He says that I have been too long without a husband, and I am too particular. He jokes, but there is truth. I am 26 winters old. Most women of my age have children already, but I was chosen as seeker for a reason. I do not accept easily. I do not trust quickly. Yet you trust me? Jacob asked. I trust what I have seen, she said. I trust that when you found a dying woman in the snow, you did not ask what color her skin was or what tribe she belonged to. You simply acted. That tells me who you are at your core. One of White Eagle's companions spoke urgently from the door, pointing outside. Through the window, Jacob could see that the snowfall had intensified. What had been soft flakes was now a driving storm. White Eagle stood speaking rapidly to Ayanna. They must leave now, she translated, or risk being trapped here by the storm. White Eagle says I should return with them. that I have been gone long enough, that the tribe will worry." "And what do you say?" Jacob asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "I say that I would like to stay, to give you time to think, to ask questions, to understand what you would be choosing, but only if you wish it." Jacob found himself nodding before he'd fully thought it through. "Stay, at least until the storm passes, and we can talk more." White Eagle seemed satisfied with this answer. He spoke directly to Jacob in halting English. "You are good man. Ayanna sees true. Take time. Think. We return in 1 moon." He held up his fingers to be clear. 1 month. If you decide yes, she brings you to us. If you decide no, she comes home alone. No shame either way. This is the right way. With that, the 3 men departed, vanishing into the storm as suddenly as they'd appeared. Jacob and Ayanna were left alone in the cabin, the fire crackling, the weight of everything that had been said settling over them like snow on pine branches. For a while neither spoke. Then Jacob said, "You really would have frozen out there." "Yes." "But you were still evaluating me. Even half frozen, you were watching to see what I would do." "Yes," she said again. "It is my burden to always be watching, always judging. Do you know what that is like? To meet someone and be unable to simply meet them, because you must always be asking, is this person suitable? Would they bring strength or weakness to my people? It is exhausting." There was such weariness in her voice that Jacob felt his resentment softening. She hadn't asked for this role. She'd been chosen for it, burdened with it, sent out alone into a harsh world with the future of her people resting on her judgment. In its way, that was a heavier load than any he'd carried. "I need to check the horses," he said. "Make sure they're secure against the storm." "I will help," she said immediately. They worked together in the driving snow, ensuring his 2 horses had enough feed and water, that the small barn was secure against the wind. The work was familiar, requiring no words, just the easy coordination of 2 people who understood what needed to be done. When they returned to the cabin, both covered in snow, Jacob found himself laughing at the absurdity of it all. "What is funny?" Ayanna asked, brushing snow from her hair. "This morning, my biggest worry was whether I had enough salt pork to last until spring. Now I'm considering joining a tribe and possibly getting married. It's a significant change." She smiled, that same transformative expression he'd seen before. "Life is like a river. Sometimes it flows smooth. Sometimes it turns suddenly and throws you against the rocks. The question is whether you fight the current or learn to move with it." That night, as another storm raged outside, they sat by the fire and she told him stories. Stories of her people, of their history, of the old ways when they'd ranged freely across the mountains and plains. She spoke of healing practices, of how to read the weather and the behavior of animals, of ceremonies and celebrations, and gradually she began to tell him about herself, not as the seeker, but as Ayanna. She had been married once before, briefly, when she was 18. Her husband had been a young warrior, brave and strong, but he'd been lost in a confrontation with white soldiers over a disputed hunting ground. It was a story she told without tears, but with a hollowness in her voice that spoke of old pain, never fully healed. After he was gone, she said, "I thought I would never want to trust my heart to another. The pain was too great. But White Eagle came to me 3 years later and told me I had been chosen as seeker. He said that to help my people find strength, I would have to open myself to the possibility of connection again, even if it frightened me. He said that fear is not a reason to stop living." "He sounds like a wise man," Jacob said. "He is, but wisdom does not make the task easier. For 2 years I have traveled in the season when the snows melt, watching, searching. I have seen men who seemed strong but were cruel, men who seemed kind but were weak, men who would have taken from my people rather than adding to them. Again and again I returned home alone, and each time I wondered if I was too particular, if my judgment was flawed. And now I think perhaps I was waiting for someone who would not be easy to find, someone who had removed himself from the world, not because he hated it, but because he loved what it could be, and was disappointed by what it had become." Jacob stirred the fire, watching the flames dance. "You see a lot in a man, based on a few days. I see what is there to be seen. The question is whether you see the same in yourself." Sheet. Over the following days, as the storm slowly cleared, they fell into a routine. Jacob tended his traps, and Ayanna came with him, learning the land, asking questions about his techniques. In the evenings, she taught him words in her language, laughing at his pronunciation, patiently correcting him. She showed him how her people prepared food, using methods he'd never considered. She told him about the structure of the tribe, the role of elders, the way decisions were made communally rather than by a single chief. It is not so different from a town council, she explained, except that everyone has a voice, not just the men. The women speak on matters of the home, the children, the future. The men speak on matters of hunting, defense, trade. But the elders, both men and women, speak on all matters because they have the wisdom of years. And where would I fit in such a structure, Jacob asked. Wherever your skills are needed. You know, trapping, trading, building. These are valuable skills. You would teach them to our young men. In time, as you learned our ways, you might be asked to sit in council, or you might prefer to remain at the edges, using your skills to help, but not seeking authority. Both are honored among us. It was a seductive vision, Jacob had to admit. A community built on mutual support rather than competition. A place where his skills would be valued not for the profit they could generate, but for the way they strengthened everyone. He'd spent 3 years alone, telling himself he preferred it that way. But in Ayana's presence, he was forced to confront the truth. He was lonely, but he was also afraid of failing, of not being enough, of bringing harm to a people who had already suffered so much. He said as much to Ayana one evening as they sat by the fire. What if I'm not what you think I am? What if I'm just a man who ran away from his problems, and I'll run again when things get difficult? She was quiet for a long moment before responding. Do you know what I have learned in my travels? The men who boast of their strength, who speak with certainty about what they will do, these are often the ones who fail when tested. But the men who question themselves, who admit their fears, they are the ones who find unexpected courage when it is needed. You doubt yourself, Jacob. That is not a weakness. It is the sign of a man who thinks before he acts. You give me too much credit, and you give yourself too little. She leaned forward, her expression intense. I will tell you a truth. When I first saw you, when you carried me from the snow, my first thought was, this man will save me so he can feel virtuous. He will help me, but he will expect gratitude, obedience, perhaps more. I have seen this pattern many times. But then you simply cared for me. You asked little. You demanded nothing. You treated me as a person, not as a burden or a prize. That is when I knew. Knew what? That perhaps I had finally found what I had been seeking. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jacob felt his heart beating faster, felt the weight of the choice that was settling over him like a cloak. To say yes would mean leaving everything familiar, stepping into a world he didn't fully understand. But to say no would mean what? Returning to his solitary existence, forever wondering what might have been? On the 10th day after White Eagle's visit, Jacob woke to clear skies and a world transformed by fresh snow. The storm had passed, leaving everything clean and bright. Ayana was already up, standing at the window, looking out at the pristine landscape. It is beautiful, she said softly. Your valley. It is, Jacob agreed, moving to stand beside her. But it's a lonely beauty. She turned to look at him. It does not have to be. And there it was, the question that had been building between them since that first night. Jacob found himself thinking of his life before this valley, the noise and violence of the mining camps, the betrayal of friends, the grinding despair of watching men destroy themselves for wealth. He'd thought he was escaping, but maybe he'd just been hiding. Tell me honestly, he said, if I come with you, if I join your tribe, will there be resentment? Will there be others who see me as an outsider, taking what isn't mine? Perhaps, she said, and he appreciated her honesty. Some of our young men may feel pride wounded. Some of our elders may question my choice, but White Eagle supports this, and his word carries weight. And Jacob, you would not be taking anything. You would be offering yourself in service to the tribe. That is different. Those who truly care about our people's future will see the distinction. And us? He asked quietly. If I come, are we? We begin, she said simply. We see if what seems possible becomes real. I will not lie to you and say I feel nothing. These days together, I have seen not just your strength, but your gentleness, not just your skill, but your willingness to learn. I have seen you, Jacob Matthews, and I find that I would like to continue seeing you." It was perhaps the most straightforward declaration of interest he'd ever received, and he found himself smiling despite the seriousness of the moment. "You don't waste words, do you?" "Life is too short for games," she said. "My first husband taught me that. Every day is a gift. We should not spend it pretending to feel less than we do." Jacob looked out at the valley one more time, at the cabin he'd built with his own hands, at the life he'd constructed in solitude. It had served its purpose. It had given him time to heal, to find peace after the chaos of the mining camps. But perhaps it was time to stop hiding. Perhaps it was time to risk connection again, to step out of his self-imposed isolation and try to be part of something larger than himself. 1 month? White Eagle said. Yes, he will return in 1 month. Then we have time. Time for you to tell me more about your people, about what would be expected of me. Time for me to prepare, to decide if I'm strong enough for this. You are, she said with such conviction that he almost believed her. The remaining weeks passed in a strange mixture of domesticity and instruction. Ayanna taught him her language in earnest now, drilling him on vocabulary and pronunciation. She explained the customs and courtesies of her tribe, the things he must never do, the things that would be expected. She told him about the annual patterns of movement, the sacred places, the ceremonies that mark the turning of the seasons. In turn, Jacob shared his own history more fully. He told her about growing up on a farm in Ohio, about losing his parents to fever when he was 16, about drifting west with no real plan beyond getting away from the memories. He described the brutal education of the mining camps, the friends he'd made and lost, the moment when he'd realized he had to leave or lose himself entirely. You were brave to walk away, Ayanna said. Many men cannot. They become trapped by their own choices, unable to see another path. I didn't feel brave. I felt like a coward. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit that the path we are on leads nowhere good and then choose a different path. They grew comfortable with each other in ways both small and significant. Jacob learned that Ayanna sang while she worked, old songs in her language that she couldn't fully translate, but whose meanings she could convey through emotion. She learned that Jacob talked to his horses as if they were people, carrying on one-sided conversations that made her laugh. They discovered they both loved the deep silence of the forest after a snowfall, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. And slowly, carefully, they began to explore the possibility of something more than friendship. It started with small things, hands touching as they passed objects, sitting closer by the fire, the way their eyes would meet and hold. Then, one evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and pink, Ayanna reached out and took his hand. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Even if you come to my people, even if you stay, I am not a prize you have won. I am a woman making a choice, just as you are a man making a choice. We would be partners, equals. This is important to me." "It's important to me too," Jacob said, squeezing her hand. "I've seen what happens when men treat women as possessions. It destroys everyone involved." She smiled. "Good. Then we understand each other." That night they kissed for the first time, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. It felt right in a way Jacob hadn't experienced before. Not just physical attraction, but a deeper recognition, as if he'd found something he hadn't known he'd been missing. When White Eagle returned exactly 1 month later, he found them sitting outside the cabin in the weak winter sunshine, Jacob attempting to weave a basket under Ayanna's patient instruction. The old man's weathered face broke into a smile. "I see," he said in English, then continued in his own language, which Ayanna translated. "He says that he can see the decision has been made and that his old eyes are pleased by what they see." Jacob stood brushing wood shavings from his pants. He'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times, but now that it was here, the words came simply. "I would like to come with you, to learn your ways, to help your people if I can, and to see where this path leads for Ayanna and me." White Eagle nodded gravely. "This is good, but you understand, this is not easy path. Our ways are not your ways. There will be times you miss this place, this solitude. There will be times when you feel like stranger. You must have patience with yourself and with us." "I understand." You bring what you need. We leave in 3 days. Time enough to close this place for winter, to prepare." Those 3 days were a whirlwind of activity. Jacob packed his essential tools, his few precious books, his hunting rifle, and ammunition. He prepared the cabin for a potentially long absence, storing what couldn't be taken, securing what needed protection from weather and animals. Ayanna helped with everything, working alongside him with that quiet efficiency he'd come to appreciate. On the last evening in the cabin, they sat by the fire one final time. "Are you frightened?" Ayanna asked. "Terrified," Jacob admitted, "but also excited. It's a strange combination. That is how we know we are truly alive," she said. "When we feel fear and excitement together, it means we are stepping into the unknown, and that is where all meaningful things happen." The journey to the tribe's winter camp took 4 days. They traveled west, climbing higher into the mountains, following trails that were invisible to Jacob's eyes but clear as highways to White Eagle and his companions. They passed through forests of pine and aspen, crossed frozen streams, and climbed ridges that offered views of a landscape so vast and untouched it took Jacob's breath away. On the 4th day, they descended into a protected valley where the tribe had made their winter camp. Smoke rose from multiple fires, and as they approached, people emerged from hide-covered lodges to watch them come. Jacob felt dozens of eyes upon him, assessing, judging, wondering. His heart hammered in his chest. White Eagle raised his hand in greeting and called out in his language. An older woman emerged from the largest lodge, her face lined with age, but her posture straight and proud. She and White Eagle spoke at length, occasionally glancing at Jacob, and then she approached him directly. "I am Winter Moon," she said in careful English, "the eldest of the Women's Council. Ayanna is as a granddaughter to me. If she has chosen you, then I will trust her judgment. But know this. You will be watched. You will be tested, not with tricks, but with life. How you respond to difficulty, to disappointment, to the daily challenges of living with others. This will show us who you truly are." "I understand," Jacob said, "and I thank you for the chance to prove myself." She smiled slightly. "We shall see. Come, you must be hungry." What followed was unlike anything Jacob had experienced. The tribe gathered in the central area of the camp, and a feast was prepared. Food was shared freely, passed from hand to hand. Children ran and played, their laughter cutting through the cold air. Young men eyed Jacob with a mixture of curiosity and challenge. Young women whispered and giggled, casting glances at both him and Ayanna. White Eagle stood and spoke at length, with Ayanna quietly translating in Jacob's ear. He told the story of the seeker's journey, of the many places she had gone and the many men she had observed. He spoke of the storm and Jacob's act of rescue, of the days they had spent together, of the decision that had been made. And then he said something that made several people gasp. "What did he say?" Jacob whispered. "He said that the spirits had guided me to you, that your cabin was not a place I found by chance, but by fate, that the storm itself was a test sent by the spirits to reveal your true nature." There was discussion after that, voices raised in what seemed like argument, but which Ayanna explained was simply how the tribe discussed important matters. Everyone had a right to speak, and they exercised that right vigorously. Finally, Winter Moon raised her hand for silence. She spoke directly to Jacob, and Ayanna translated. "She says that the tribe accepts White Eagle's judgment and my choice. You will be given a lodge at the edge of the camp, a place to live while you learn our ways. You will be given a teacher who will help you understand our language and customs, and you will be given tasks, ways to contribute to the tribe. In the spring, if both you and the tribe agree that this is right, there will be a ceremony to make you one of us fully. Until then, you are a guest, but a welcome one." Jacob felt relief wash over him. This was a beginning, a chance. That was all he could ask for. The following months were the most challenging and rewarding of Jacob's life. He was assigned to work with a man named Running Deer, who spoke a little English and had infinite patience. Running Deer taught him the proper way to hunt in this terrain, techniques different from what Jacob had learned. He learned to track game through deep snow, to predict where elk and deer would shelter, to make clean ends that respected the animal's spirit. He learned the language, slowly and often painfully, stumbling over pronunciations that made children laugh. But he persisted, and gradually, words became sentences, and sentences became conversations. He learned the stories of the tribe, the history that was passed down through oral tradition. He learned about the spirits that inhabited the land, the respect that must be shown to all living things. And he learned about community in a way he'd never experienced. In the mining camps, every man was out for himself. Here, everything was shared. A successful hunt meant the whole tribe ate. A new skill one person learned was taught to everyone. Children were raised not just by their parents, but by the entire community, with elders passing down wisdom and young adults teaching physical skills. It wasn't perfect. There were tensions, disagreements, moments of frustration. Some of the younger men resented his presence, seeing him as an outsider receiving attention he hadn't earned. Some of the older people were suspicious of his motivations, wondering if he would stay or disappear when things became difficult. But Jacob persevered. He worked hard, learned quickly, and most importantly, he listened. He didn't try to change things or suggest that his way was better. He simply tried to understand and to contribute where he could. His skills as a trapper did prove valuable, and he taught several young men his techniques, which they combined with their own knowledge to even greater effect. Through it all, Ayanna was his anchor and his guide. They spent time together every day, sometimes working side by side, sometimes simply sitting and talking. Their relationship deepened gradually, built on a foundation of respect and shared experience. There was no dramatic declaration of love, no sudden moment of realization. Instead, there was a slow, steady growing together, like two trees whose branches gradually intertwine. One evening in early spring, as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared, Ayanna took Jacob to a place overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The choice to come here?" Jacob thought about his old cabin, about the solitude he'd once treasured. Then he thought about the past months, the laughter around evening fires, the satisfaction of teaching skills to eager students, the way children had gradually stopped seeing him as a stranger and started seeing him as simply another adult in their world. He thought about working beside running deer, about the friendship that had developed despite the language barrier, and he thought about Ayanna, about the way she'd become essential to his daily existence. "No," he said, "I don't regret it. This is harder than living alone, that's true, but it's also richer, more meaningful. I didn't realize how much I'd lost by cutting myself off from people until I found them again." She took his hand. "White Eagle says that next week, at the spring ceremony, they will formally adopt you into the tribe. You will be given a new name, one that reflects who you have become, and after that, if you wish, we could be married in our way." Jacob's heart raced. "Is that what you wish?" "I wish to spend my life with you," she said simply. "I have seen you at your worst, when you struggled to understand our customs, when you made mistakes, when you grew frustrated with yourself. And I have seen you at your best, when you patiently taught our young men, when you sat with our elders and listened to their stories, when you showed kindness to our children. I know who you are, Jacob Matthews, and I choose you. The question is whether you choose me." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "I do. God help me. I do." The spring ceremony was held on the night of the full moon. The entire tribe gathered in a circle around a great fire. White Eagle and Winter Moon presided, speaking in turns, their voices carrying across the valley. Jacob stood in the center, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, but no longer frightened by their scrutiny. White Eagle called him forward and spoke at length. Then Ayanna, who stood beside him, translated loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You came to us as a stranger. You were invited not because we needed your strength alone, but because we needed your character. You could have chosen the easy path, the solitary path, the path that asked nothing of you but survival. Instead, you chose the difficult path, the path of community, the path that demands you grow beyond yourself. For this, we honor you. For this, we welcome you. From this day forward, you are no longer an outsider. You are one of us." Winter Moon stepped forward, carrying a ceremonial robe decorated with quill work and beadwork. She placed it over Jacob's shoulders and spoke in her ancient voice. Ayanna translated again. "Your new name is Walks Between, for you are a man who walks between two worlds, understanding both, belonging to both. You bring us knowledge of the white man's ways, but you have chosen to honor ours. This is a precious gift. We thank you for it. We welcome you. Walks Between." The tribe erupted in a cheer, and Jacob felt tears streaming down his face. He'd spent years running from community, from connection, from the pain of being let down by others. Now, here in this remote mountain valley, surrounded by people who had been strangers mere months ago, he finally felt like he'd found home. The marriage ceremony followed a week later. It was simpler than he'd expected, focused on the commitment they made to each other before the tribe. They promised to support each other, to work together for the good of their people, to honor each other's spirits. They exchanged gifts. He gave her a beautifully crafted knife he'd spent weeks making, and she gave him a shirt she'd sewn herself, decorated with symbols of protection and strength. And then it was done. They were married. They were partners. They were beginning a life together that neither had planned, but both had chosen. Years later, when travelers would occasionally pass through the territory and ask about the white man living with the tribe, Jacob would think back to that winter night when he'd found a shivering woman in the snow. He'd thought he was simply doing what any decent person would do, offering shelter to someone in need. He hadn't known he was being tested. He hadn't known his simple act of kindness would change the entire trajectory of his life. But looking at Ayanna, at the children they would eventually raise together, at the community he'd become an integral part of, he couldn't imagine having made any other choice. The solitary life he'd built in his cabin had been safe, but it had also been empty. This life was harder, messier, more complicated, but it was full. It was meaningful. It was, he realized, what he'd been searching for all along without knowing it. He'd let a shivering lady stay the night, not knowing she was sent to choose a husband for the tribe. But in the end, the choice had been mutual. They'd chosen each other, freely and fully, and in doing so they'd both found something neither had known they needed: a place to belong, a person to trust, and a future worth building together.